Hello, my name is Andrew Whitehouse and I'm a specialist in neurological diversity and provide strategies, interventions and training for parents, professional and young people with autism, ADHD, pathological demand avoidance (PDA) and related conditions, as well as providing strategies for behaviour and anxiety. I work alongside a number of organisations including People First Education, the London Borough of Sutton, the London Borough of Barnet, Bishop Grosseteste University, the University of Lincoln and many others. I have a number of roles including training for education professionals in early years settings, schools, colleges and universities, observing learners in the learning environment and providing practical solutions to help them achieve their potential. I have an extensive conference profile including delivering the TEDx From Disability to Superpowers, an analysis of some of the many benefits of having a neurodiverse mind. I'm also diagnosed with severe ADHD and have recently published my first book, Andrew and the Magic Givershometer, Growing Up with ADHD. If I were to describe my role simply, I would call myself a solution finder. My mantra is more of what works and less of what doesn't. I look at what works and maximise that, and then I look at what is causing difficulties and try and remove it from the scenario. Some of this work is so simple it defies logic, but nonetheless it often gets missed, and simplicity is often the solution in itself. Allowing a child to keep a preferred toy with them as a calming resource, asking a child to contribute to their strategic behaviour plan, or engaging them in a conversation about their special interests to help them to regulate their anxieties, and the results can be quite incredible. In my work in schools, I look at needs first and build the strategies around them. In the summer of 2018, I was contacted by the British Academy of Audiology, BAA, to deliver the Bamford Lecture on creating autism-friendly audiology clinics at the BAA conference later that year. This call was the culmination of 13 years of informal conversations that I had been having with the senior audiologist at Queen's Medical Centre Audiology Clinic at the Rope Walk, Nottingham. It seems that we were both very interested in the links between autism and hearing loss. Mostly the fact that a large proportion of autistic people are visual processors. And of course, for clear reasons, many deaf children respond well to the same visual interventions which I had been used to putting in place for autistic children. Indeed, I had been engaged by Doncaster School for the Deaf to put some of those strategies and interventions in place for autistic and non-autistic deaf children. Looking back to 2006, my 2-year-old son was being assessed for a hearing problem, which turned out to be more complicated than we had thought. This involved him having multiple trips from Lincoln to Nottingham along what was then a single carriageway A46, 500 miles long and densely populated by milk floats and tractors. Thinking about the journey and the potential for hold-ups meant that the trip was stressful before we'd even left the house. It still makes me shudder now. Nonetheless, we did this for years, quickly becoming more and more adept at what might now be called life hacks. The key objective of the day was to make the trip fun. Where there is fun, there is less anxiety. Where was the best place to park? Should we use the park and ride? Where were the good child-friendly places to eat? What was going on in Nottingham to entertain me and my son whilst we were waiting for an appointment? And by far the greatest of all life hacks, I would carry a packet of nuts and raisins in my pocket to help keep blood sugars up and hangry down. Yes, there were the occasional disasters. One particular stressful time springs to mind when we lost a Lego head on the park and ride bus. Ultimately though, we became very skilled at making these trips. My goodness, we even began to enjoy them, indeed look forward to them, whilst the A46 gradually widened and became a dual carriageway. So when I was asked to deliver the lecture on autism-friendly audiology clinics, I felt that my professional knowledge of autism, combined with my years of trips to the audiology clinic as a parent, was plenty to get me started, so off I went and did the research. What I did know was that the visit was way before the actual visit, if that makes sense. We should tell families about traffic hotspots. We should make them aware of best parking. We can send out photos and short bios of staff that they are likely to encounter. My goodness, I even suggested that we could even make a short YouTube video of what it is like to walk up the stairs and walk into the clinic. It was very comprehensive. Nothing was left to chance, and yet at the same time, nothing was groundbreaking. Just an in-depth dig into what happens and how we could take the mystery, stress and anxiety out of it. It was very well received and opened up a lot of necessary lines of investigation. Indeed, the work was so simple yet in-depth, it has been adapted by many other environments other than audiology clinics to good success. This year at the BAA conference, I will be installing what we are calling the A-Zone, a fully resourced mock-up of an autism and ADHD friendly clinic. This will be a great opportunity to allow professionals to experience some of the anxiety-busting strategies and resources that are available. And by the way, the original Bamford lecture is still out there online if you ever want to check it out. So, here's the exciting bit, moving into 2021 and beyond. I've talked about keeping it simple and alluded to missing the obvious. So imagine my reaction when I was approached to discuss how children and young people with a learning disability and/or who are autistic don't always have access to hearing checks, or that the checks are not always appropriate to meet their needs. And that the movement is towards changing this, and as part of the NHS long-term plan, NH England and NHS Improvement is looking to provide hearing checks for every child. And in this case, Co-Production Collective are working with NHS England and NHS Improvement to put on a series of sharing ideas events to gather views and advance ideas about how to develop more acceptable hearing checks for children and young people with a learning disability and/or who are autistic in residential, special schools and colleges. Simple but almost revolutionary in its concept. These children and young people should get their hearing checks on site in their residential school setting. I've been asked to share my thoughts on tackling complex challenges, and the first thing that came to mind is that by carrying out these checks in a familiar environment, we are facing the opposite. We are circumnavigating many of the complex challenges around getting these checks to children and young people. For example, if we focus on autism, one of the most important considerations is sensory. What does the environment look like, smell like? Are there familiar sounds? Or are those things different and frightening as they might be if you are visiting an unfamiliar clinic? I would suggest that in familiar surroundings, these sensory experiences will be mostly familiar. Many autistic children don't cope well with change, so we try to minimise that change. We can't completely avoid change, but we can have a situation where there is an extra person, a professional, in a familiar environment, one change in amongst many recognisables. And if we prepare the child sufficiently by showing them photographs of the visitor, giving them information about the visitor, and adding the visit to pre-existing timetables and schedules that the child accesses, we can minimise the disruption even further. This is something that I do on a regular basis. It really does take the mystery away. Be aware, outside visits to residential special schools are far from a rare occurrence, and the children will be mostly used to visits from external agencies. And handled correctly, visitors can be a relatively stress-free experience. And nobody needs to lose anything on a bus, go to a strange town and visit a clinic. But they can have their favourite snacks if they so desire. Of course, we would need to communicate the situation well by explaining clearly what is going to happen, both in very simple terms, like a visual story, a simple strategy for preparing children and young people for new situations. This one comes under sometimes other people I will, this is. And so sometimes medical people need to check things about me, including my hearing. Other people will need to come into my school to check my hearing. I will allow the medical person to check my hearing. This is going to help me to hear properly. Very simple resource. Or in a more detailed list, possibly with clear images, breaking down the process into bite-sized chunks. That would work. These visual communication strategies being more effective than auditory verbal communication. And they can be accessed repeatedly without them changing. That's the beauty of the written word. The audiologist will need to build a dialogue with a key member of staff in advance of the check. They can't just arrive in the school and carry out the check. This may involve the sharing of a provision plan which clearly outlines the pupil's needs and strategies to meet them, and essential do's and don'ts. If there are any stressful situations and the child needs to take a time out, that's fine too. We can have a strategy in place, or indeed use any pre-existing strategies the child or the school may already use in challenging situations. I can see many benefits to carrying out hearing checks in the residential school setting, but there are lots of things we will need to consider. Autistic children can present with a lack of flexible thinking. That is to say that they may have a special interest. Can that special interest be used to minimise the impact of the in-school check? i.e., can that special interest be an effective distraction technique? These special interests may be contained within the pupil school provision plan or ascertained through conversations with key member of staff. As part of that lack of flexible thought, can we integrate the check into the already existing systems, routines and timetables? Is the relevant communication in place to explain what is going to happen well in advance? And are there further communication strategies to be implemented during the checks? Based on the previous point, is that communication sufficient to meet the social and emotional understanding needs of the child? For example, is this a child who doesn't like being spoken to? Has enough been done to keep the sensory environment the same as normal? The impact of extra people in the school need to be kept minimal. This might include avoiding sensory changes, such as the audiologist not wearing perfume or aftershave. What sort of environment within the school is being used? Is it a bedroom, a communal area? Or is the answer to this question likely to be different for different children in the setting? At what time of day is the check happening? Is it coinciding with a favourite lesson? Does it interfere with playtime? And most importantly, think about challenging behaviour, or don't. Nobody wants to be in trouble, nobody wants to upset people, nobody wants to annoy people, and nobody wants to cause problems for people. What we are actually talking about when we discuss challenging behaviour is anxious behaviour. Anxious behaviour is a different thing completely. Okay, so the outcome might be the same. The outcome might be shouting at somebody else, or swearing at somebody, or running away, or whatever it may be, but the reality is that it's not caused by someone wanting to challenge you, it's caused by somebody who feels anxious. They don't know any other way through this situation than to react in a negative manner. So if you think about challenging behaviour as anxious behaviour, you will understand it so much more. I see this project as the practical next steps from the work that I have been carrying out over the last few years, and have extremely high hopes for the future outcomes. For me, the analogy of the swan is appropriate. Keeping it simple is the key. Above water it should appear graceful and seamless, as if very little is happening, but below the waterline there is a lot of work to be done. And to make it work, the audiologist needs to be the flexibility, but the results will be worth it. Thank you.